Months before the GameCube released, Nintendo launched the Game Boy Advance, which provided some of the greatest handheld experiences ever crafted. With the GBA's strong launch, Nintendo and third-party developers were full force on that handheld and phasing out the Game Boy Color. The GameCube and Game Boy Advance were seen as an ultimate duo for the home console gaming and handheld gaming market. However, what is fascinating to note is that there are actually a handful of games that released on the GameCube that actually had Game Boy Color versions. In this episode, I want to cover every GameCube game that actually had a Game Boy Color counterpart. So, sit back, relax, and let's dive into this episode. First up is San Francisco Rush 2049. Published by Midway Games and developed by Handheld Games. Now, here is one that may technically be cheating the cover, as San Francisco Rush 2049 did not get a standalone release on the GameCube, but was available to play on the Midway Arcade Treasures 3. This contained the Dreamcast version of the game, which was part of the 6th generation of consoles, so I'm counting it here. Anyway, San Francisco Rush 2049 was an awesome racing game back in the arcades, as well as its home console ports, which blended racing and exploration, as well as adding wings to balance your car when airborne. So, with the Game Boy Color version, you'd think they'd try to capitalize a bit on this, right? Well, not quite. Here we have an isometric racer somewhat akin to RC Pro-Am, just not as awesome as that one. Rush 2049 has you choose from one of 5 cars and race across 9 tracks. Controls do take some getting used to, as it is very easy to oversteer and spin out of control. However, the brake button is your friend, and pressing that on turns while accelerating still provides far more grip. There are burning tire icons littered throughout the tracks that initiate a turbo boost, and nabbing these are essential to passing your opponents. Levels start off basic and become more intricate the more you advance, leading to branching paths and even jumps in between tracks. I do like that the main menu theme is an 8-bit rendition of the console version's theme, and even has clear voiceover samples by the announcer, but the only music during races are 5-second themes when reaching checkpoints. It's a shame because those 5-second music samples are pretty solid. The visuals get the job done, and while nothing amazing, it has some nice pixel artwork here and there. Also, what's very odd is that there's no multiplayer link cable option at all, which is a missed opportunity for this handheld version. In the end, I won't sit here and tell you to play this over the console version, but it's still enjoyable in short bursts once you grasp the controls. Just know that this is definitely a more watered down version of the console game. Next up is Donald Duck Goin' Quackers, published and developed by Ubisoft. Donald Duck Goin' Quackers is a game that first released for the N64, PS1, and Game Boy Color, followed by the Dreamcast and then the PS2 and GameCube. While the versions varied from the 5th and 6th gen installments, the core story was the same. So, going back to the Game Boy Color version, here we have an endearing 2D platformer that was all about getting from point A to point B in each level. It starts off quite easy and ramps up pretty smoothly in difficulty. Donald doesn't really have much of a moveset. He can basically just walk, jump, and double jump, and that's kind of about it. He can pick up these power-ups, which makes him hyper and grants him the ability to run and break open doors and butt slam floors open. He's also invincible for a short time while in this hyper mode. There are even chasing sequences throughout the worlds that help change up the pacing from the traditional platforming levels. As you progress, platforming will start requiring problem solving as well, and again, it all just ramps up great difficulty-wise, especially for younger audiences. There are even boss fights that await at the end of each world and provide a nice challenge. I should note that Donald can only take 2 hits before losing a life. His good health stance is him cheerfully walking while taking a hit puts him in a pretty angry mood, and he'll strut around that way unless you pick up a health item. It's an interesting premise for the health system, but more importantly, Ubisoft nailed the animation for Donald in this game. They did a fantastic job with the pixel art and animation and captures Donald's personality perfectly. Audio does a good job of providing whimsical 8-bit tunes while also changing in tone depending on the world you're in and the status that Donald is in. Overall, this was a game that I enjoyed quite a bit back in the day, and honestly, it still feels like a nice companion to the console version if you're looking for a retro side-scrolling platformer. Next up is Madden 2002, published by EA Sports and developed by 3D6 Games. Madden 2002 was a launch title for the GameCube, but it did have a Game Boy Color release prior to that. This handheld version of Madden brings about as much as you can expect from an 8-bit handheld version of a football game. It has your traditional exhibition mode as well as a season mode to tackle with your favorite team of choice. You can check your game schedule, make some adjustments to the team, and then take on the team that you're up against for that week. Gameplay transitions fairly well on here from its console counterpart, as you can swap between players and tackle while playing defense, and then throw the ball and also dive while playing offense. It's a very watered down experience, sure, but the essentials are here to make the game playable and, dare I say, enjoyable. I was actually impressed to even see an instant replay mode here. However, I did have some frustrations with swapping players, as the game tends to not swap to the player closest to the opposing player who has the ball, leading to constantly swapping players until you're finally the one you want to be that needs to tackle the opponent. Also, for a game with a season mode, or any sports game for this matter, why on earth is there a password system here instead of a battery save option? Thankfully, there are more modern solutions to play some of these games that allow for save states like an EverDrive GB or playing on the Analog Pocket. Visuals do a good job of bringing the sport to the small screen and has fairly solid animations, although the football does look like a potato. Audio is decent as well, with music throughout the menus and suitable sound effects during gameplay. There's even voice samples for the quarterback when calling a play. Overall, this isn't a bad football game at all for the Game Boy Color, and it's far more enjoyable than I expected. Next up is RoboCop, published by Titus and developed by Mirage. Alright, so RoboCop did have a GameCube release in Japan, which I covered in my GameCube Games in Japan episode almost 2 years ago. This happened to be the same game that released on the PlayStation 2 in Europe and Xbox in North America. I know, this game had a weird release all around. While I wasn't a big fan of what I've played of the game on the GameCube, I could see myself playing that game to completion one day. But did you know that there was a RoboCop game also released by Titus for the Game Boy Color? This one was exclusive to Europe, and when I fired it up, I was somewhat excited to see how it was. Maybe it's a hidden gem? Maybe not. Here we have an overhead view action game where RoboCop is the size of an ant and moves as slow as molasses. The game does have an original storyline and brings in iconic characters from the original films like Lazarus, who can actually provide upgrades to RoboCop, and his partner, Officer Lewis. Before tackling a mission, you will check your computer for messages and then check in with Officer Lewis as well as Lazarus before going out there to dispense justice against criminal scum. Once in gameplay, RoboCop will have various objectives to complete across fairly big maps per level. The first level, for example, has you trying to find evidence as well as taking down a criminal called Nex, while the second level has you rescuing hostages in a junkyard. There will be both civilians and thugs out there in the streets of Detroit, and when facing them, a reticule will appear and notify you if someone is a civilian or a gang member to take out. It's a neat aesthetic, but I think it's fairly obvious that the guys holding the guns and bats are the ones to take out. You have roughly 3 to 4 lives to get through a level, and if you die, you will start at a restart point, as the game calls it. These felt like they were randomly triggered when running along the map. Visuals overall are pretty poor, while the audio is thankfully on the better side of things. Overall, this is a game I was really hoping would have been a hidden gem. Instead, I think there's a reason why it never left Europe for release on the Game Boy Color. Sorry, Europe. Next up is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, published by Activision and developed by Hot Gen Studios. One of many launch titles for the GameCube, Activision sought to bring this installment of the Tony Hawk Pro Skater series over to any and every platform possible, including last-gen platforms like the PS1 and N64 at this time. What's interesting is, at this point, we had already seen Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 hit the Game Boy Advance earlier in that same year and brought us the closest handheld experience of the series that we would get at the time. With this version, Hot Gen Studios was handed over the reins as opposed to Natsume, who did the Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 games on the Game Boy Color, and they really tried to bring a more authentic experience to the 8-bit handheld. Choosing from one of many skaters, you will tackle objectives across various locales such as the Foundry, Canada, and the airport, just to name a few. I remember playing this one way back in the day when it first released since a friend of mine had it, and at first I thought this game was pretty awful. I couldn't pull off as many combos in a trick, and felt the objectives weren't as feasible to complete due to the wonky physics and controls. All I thought was, yeah, I'll stick with Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 on the Game Boy Advance for my handheld experience. However, it was not until several years ago I ended up buying myself a sealed copy of the game, opening it up, and tackling it again. It took some time, but once I grasped the controls and trick system in this version, I was enjoying it far more than I was with my initial impressions. You move left and right to gain speed for jumps and ollies. You press the A button to ollie and hold it down before releasing for a bigger ollie. Once in the air, the A button now becomes a grab trick button, and the B button becomes flip tricks. And pressing a certain direction on the D-pad with the button initiates a different trick variation. The B button also allows for grinds, and much like tricks, pressing a direction on the D-pad while pressing B to grind allows for varied grinds. Now, what's tricky is understanding the timing of doing air tricks and grind tricks to keep the combo going. You can also do manuals by pressing up then down, or vice versa when your jump is about to land a trick to keep that combo going. But that window to do it is very fine. You can also use ramps to move up and down the level, allowing for more areas to traverse and trick on. Objectives are as expected within the series, such as score X number of points, to collect skate, to more specific level-based objectives that actually alter the level as well. Visuals are actually a bit more detailed than previous installments, with far more fluid animations and more details within the levels themselves. I do like the music in this game too, but I never liked that there was never any music within the actual gameplay itself. Instead, music is relegated only to the menus in this game. Overall, while this was the last Tony Hawk Pro Skater game to release for the Game Boy Color, it really was the closest experience to the console experience translated for the 8-bit handheld. Next up is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, published by EA Games and developed by Kryptonite Games. While the Sorcerer's Stone, or Philosopher's Stone for those over the pond, was a game that released initially for the PS1, it did receive a remake on the GameCube later on, hence why this one actually counts on the list. This turn-based RPG has players take control of Harry through his journey as a first year at Hogwarts. The game follows the events of the film fairly closely, with some variations of course to lengthen the game itself, in which it even borrows elements from the books. For example, the beginning has you venturing through Gringotts' underground vaults before Harry gets access to the vault that his parents left for him prior to their demise. Additionally, you get to even use a boat to traverse the lake before reaching Hogwarts Castle and try to dodge creatures in the water. These, for example, are events that the film doesn't quite cover the same way. The game definitely throws you into gameplay fairly quickly and has you facing off against creatures of various kinds. There can be anywhere between 1 to 3 enemies on screen at once, and strategizing which enemies to hit in order is key. It is very easy to lose a battle if you're not familiar with the spells and which enemies are weaker to specific ones. Some spells are free to use, while many others will use spell points, which replenish either when leveling up or using specific items. There's also a card system in place, which if you find 3 of a specific set, you can then select that set, which will have a passive perk to equip. The game was clearly made by a team of fans of the property. I will say, the one thing I wasn't a fan of was the frequency of enemy encounters that appear. These magical clouds showcase a battle awaits, and if you collide with it, well, it's battle time. It can be very cheap though, in that they sometimes appear a mere 2 seconds after a previous battle just ends and you walk right into the path of it. Should you lose all your health, you'll just start back at the beginning of the area and you'll have to traverse your way back to where you fell. Unless of course you fall at Hogwarts Castle, in which you'll wake up in a medical room on site. Visually, there is some nice pixel art and animations happening here. The only thing is that it actually runs at 30 frames a second and it looks slightly janky in motion. It's nothing bad, it's just jarring when a majority of Game Boy Color games actually run at a smoother frame rate. The audio is fairly decent, but the soundtrack is very forgettable. Overall, this is a really neat RPG that does the property well. If you're a Harry Potter fan, this is definitely worth checking out. Next up is Taxi 3, published by Ubisoft and developed by Visual Impact Productions. Taxi is a movie series over in France that received games based on the license. I've covered Taxi 3 for the GameCube in my GameCube games exclusive to Europe episode and wasn't a big fan of it on there. So hearing there was a Game Boy Color version that was actually exclusive to Europe, I approached this one apprehensively. Instead, what I found was a far more enjoyable version than its console counterpart. This racing game apparently has you take on events from the movie based on the still images before each level. Gameplay is fairly simple, as you must get to the end of a level while maintaining your fuel gauge, while also dodging traffic and other obstacles on the road. However, each level provides a unique objective to tackle. For example, the first stage has you stop halfway through the level to pick up flowers to deliver. Another level has you tailing a motorist on a scooter, but you can't hit him or pass him or you'll fail. The bottom right of the HUD actually shows you what to expect objective-wise. Throughout levels, you will see gas cans you can collect to keep your fuel gauge up, and also pick up nitro to use in a time of need. Dodging traffic can be somewhat frustrating, as the hit detection occasionally appears a bit off. Sometimes there's other obstacles in the road that can throw off the balance of your taxi, and you'll have to hit the brakes to stabilize the car, or you'll end up just flipping the car over and wasting valuable time. Visually, the game looks quite good. The color palette used here is great, and the animations get the job done nicely for the gameplay style it represents. The soundtrack is also very suitable and matches the gameplay nicely. Not that you'll be humming the tunes after playing it, but it's enjoyable during your playthrough. Now, the game can be challenging. Your fuel gauge seems to carry over into the next level, and if you're under 10%, the next level will start you at 10%, giving you just a little room for error just to acquire a gas can that may be on the road. There are a limited number of continues, but you can earn one usually after each level. Additionally, you can also enter a password to continue your game. I will say, I'm actually very surprised at how much I enjoyed this version and definitely preferred it over the GameCube version. And last up is the sequel, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, published by EA Games and developed by Kryptonite Games. Funny enough, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets released on the GameCube before Sorcerer's Stone's remake did. Here we have what is actually the very last North American Game Boy Color game to ever release on November 15th, 2002. This sequel looks to follow the same formula as its predecessor did, being a turn-based RPG, but exploring the events of both the film and book combined here. I will say, the game wasn't messing around early in. When exploring the Weasley's home, which is literally the first 5 to 10 minutes of gameplay, exploring the house actually had enemies waiting to attack Harry and take him down. I didn't realize the Weasley's home was that dangerous. What I do like is that the game introduces minigames earlier into the experience, which the predecessor also had, but I didn't come across any during my time playing it yet. For example, there's this whack-a-mole style minigame where you need to pull gnomes out of the garden, and it will be followed by another minigame where you have to rapidly button press to launch the gnomes off the property. The minigames here are a lot of fun and do a great job of changing up the pace in between exploration and combat. The combat UI has received an upgrade as well, and everything just feels like an improvement. Gameplay, visuals, and even the audio. Ultimately, it's more of the same as its predecessor, and that's not a bad thing. Looking back at the Game Boy Color, the library it had was quite impressive. Growing up in the golden era of gaming between the early 90s to mid 2000s, it was amazing to see the plethora of games that released across a variety of platforms. Even more so, seeing the vast differences that multiple versions of a game had across both the home console and handheld devices. So, did you play any of these games? Any that interest you after seeing them here? Any that interest you after seeing them in this episode? Sound off in the comments below, as I'd love to hear your thoughts. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will catch you all in the next episode.